Today's forum is brought to us with support from J.P. Morgan Chase and the Columbus Regional Airport Authority in partnership with the Columbus Council on World Affairs and the Greater Columbus Sister Cities International. Let's thank our sponsors and partners and welcome Gary Matich, Vice Chairman of Investment Management at J.P. Morgan Chase, to introduce today's forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for that introduction. On behalf of J.P. Morgan Chase, it's our pleasure to welcome you to today's forum on global economy from a major city perspective. As you know, it's no secret, if you work for J.P. Morgan Chase, we already have that global reach in many respects. We employ over 250 million people in over 100 cities globally. But more important than that, more important than those numbers, is the fact that we like to deliver that locally. For example, if you look at the city of Columbus, we have over 20,000 employees here. We manage global assets to the tune of over $200 billion, assets that reach around the world. So with that in mind, behind today's agenda is the fact that about 2 years ago, J.P. Morgan Chase teamed up with the Brookings Institution to create a program called the Global Cities Initiative. This is where we are going to equip civic leaders, business leaders, government leaders with information, policy directives, et cetera, to help get that global reach to cities like Columbus. If you look at Columbus right now, we are one of 6 cities that are profiled in this program. And when you look at what we've been able to do with the help of leaders like Mayor Coleman, for example, Columbus is now being looked at as a leading city in the development of economic strategies around the world. What you're going to hear today from people like the Mayor, Kenny McDonald of 2020 Columbus, Matt McGuire of the U.S. Department of Commerce, is how we in the city of Columbus are taking advantage and looking to improve globally our position in the global economy. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce someone who really doesn't need any introduction to this group of individuals. This is one of the nation's best thought leaders. This is one of the nation's best innovators. This is one of the nation's best policy experts. Without further ado, let's please welcome our Mayor, Mayor Michael Coleman.
Thank you, Gary. Now, next year's election year, I want you to say that everywhere you go. Okay. I'm so glad to be here again. This is always a wonderful forum. We're able to discuss all the issues facing our community. And today we're going to have a very interesting and vibrant discussion. You know, in Columbus, we view ourselves as global. We view ourselves as global because Ohio State attracts students from over 100 countries. We view ourselves as global because in our public schools, there are about 90 languages spoken every day in our schools and in our neighborhoods. We view ourselves global because there are 644 foreign-owned businesses. We view ourselves as global because we export more than $11.5 billion in services around the world. That's all true. But there's another truth here, and that truth is that we're not global enough. Our exports are the lowest among our peer communities. Most of our exporters are accidental exporters who are responding to leads rather than building a global strategy. Our employers struggle to find employees who are ready to get on a plane and today and fly to Latin America or Africa or Europe or Asia to do business to help our customers. And that's why in my 2013 State of the City, we called for the Columbus Global Connect, an effort that works with our partners regionally and at the federal level to create an export and global strategy for Columbus and its region. Why is this important to our city? Why is this important to our region? Because when we export products made in Columbus in our region to countries around the world, we create jobs and investment right here in our city. In fact, 4,200 jobs are created for every $1 billion in exports. Sounds like an opportunity to me. So recognizing this, since last year, we've been working with Columbus 2020 and Brookings Institute to put together a strategy that focuses on growing our global presence, especially exports. The U.S. Department of Commerce and the Obama administration are key partners in this effort. So that brings me to Matthew T. McGuire. Matthew T. McGuire is the Assistant to the Secretary and Director of the Office of Business Liaison at the Department of Commerce. In this position, he engages the business community on the Obama administration's top policy priorities. His office promotes progressive business policies that help businesses and entrepreneurs here in the United States while strengthening our international economic position and facilitating global trade by advocating for American businesses. He has a broad and varied career in international financial matters as well. And we're excited about having this PhD from Harvard, BA from Brown, and a Certificate of Religious Studies from the University of London. And he's married to Michelle and has two wonderful young daughters. Welcome to the City of Columbus.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I greatly appreciate it. The most important thing, of course, was the last thing, which is my wife and beautiful daughters. So I always like when people mention that as part of the bio. But thank you, Mayor Coleman, for your welcome and also for your leadership here. The administration has had a strong partner working with you over a number of things, and various friends back at the White House send their regards. So glad I can be here with you, and thank you for having us. I also want to thank Kenny McDonald, who I'm sure all of you know, or by name, if not in person. Kenny is the one who invited us to come here, and at the Commerce Department we've been working with Kenny for quite a while and have been very impressed with his leadership and the things he's done, which we'll talk about in a little more detail today. I also want to mention Roberta Ford, who is here. She is our commerce lead here at our local U.S. Export Assistance Center. And Roberta, some of you may work with. We probably should spend a little time. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I should mention that one of the things we always are trying to do as we talk to companies around the country is talk about some of the basic services that we provide through Roberta and her colleagues around the country, but also in the 77 countries around the world where we have Commerce Department employees whose sole job is to help U.S. businesses access those markets and to make sure that they are able to get things done from basic contract services to introductions to new distributors potentially to partners to customers. Could go on and on down the line, but it's always worth saying that Roberta is your kind of local first port of contact in accessing all those services. If I could also, there's a gentleman here who is the chairman of our local District Export Council, and I'm afraid I've forgotten your name, sir, but if you could just raise your hand. Our District Export Councils, Our District Export Councils work in communities all across the country in trying to help especially small and medium-sized businesses understand the opportunities and to export where and how they can. So thank you for coming as well. But what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about exports and why the Commerce Department and the Obama administration have been so focused on exports, and then talk a bit more about Columbus 2020 and some of the things you all are doing here. And first, I want to say congratulations. Columbus really is out front. You're really at the forefront. And while the mayor mentioned some statistics that show that Columbus maybe is not doing as much as it can, the sort of effort that you're engaging here and really bringing stakeholders together and starting to focus on this issue is one that not enough communities around the country are doing. And often I think communities don't recognize what Columbus has recognized, which is the extraordinary assets that it has, both in terms of the breadth of industries that have roots here, the entrepreneurial spirit, and the numbers of companies that have been launched here. The university, which is an extraordinary asset. People often don't realize how important universities are to businesses, both in attracting talent, in spinning off research that can be commercialized, and also creating a lifestyle that attracts people who want to come. Universities tend to have a certain vibrancy to them, and I would argue if you look around the country at the communities that are particularly strong economically, there's usually an anchor university that's helping to drive a lot of that. The reason that we have focused on cities in particular in the National Export Initiative and the Metropolitan Export Initiative is because of some of those things that I mentioned, but also because that's where so much of our growth is at this point. And if you think about the trends that we've seen over the last 10 to 20 years, it's only increasing that more and more people are moving to metropolitan areas. And as a result, there's more that's happening there. And we always kind of talk about the U.S. as a market. We always talk about the U.S. as a kind of business community across the U.S. But the truth is people live and work in local regions. They work in particular metropolitan areas. That's where most of their relationships are. That's what they draw on when they think about their next steps for growth and expansion. And so sometimes when we come at things too broadly, from a too large perspective, we're not able to actually move the levers that make things happen. The important thing as well to say about exports is the very simple fact that we keep stressing to people that 95% of the world's customers are outside of the U.S. Now, we obviously have the world's largest economy, and it's extraordinarily strong, and as we travel around the world, people are incredibly envious of the U.S., and I'll come back to that in terms of some of the basic conditions we have that allow for economic growth. But more and more of the world's customers have more and more money, and 95% are outside of our borders. So for long-term growth, it seems important that more U.S. companies need to really focus on those opportunities, even smaller-sized companies. This is something the President recognized early on in his tenure, and he launched the National Export Initiative with the goal of doubling U.S. exports in the course of 5 years. We may or may not hit that goal. It doesn't really matter in some ways if we hit that goal. The point is we wanted to put something out there that was big and ambitious and try to drive towards it. And over the last 4 years, we've actually had record numbers of exports in this country. This year, we had $2.3 trillion in exports. And so increasingly, people are focusing more and seeming to go in that direction. Equally importantly, though, we have an all-time high of about 14% of GDP is coming from exports in the U.S. right now. And so the point is that more companies seem to be focused on these growth opportunities and are moving in the right direction. And it's useful also in thinking about that in terms of the dual sides of that, both sides of that equation, in the sense that exports are hugely important, but we've also been focused, and I know that here Kenny and others have been focused on inbound investment and getting overseas companies to base here or to build here or to grow here. This is important for exports as well, in that 20% of U.S. exports are from companies that are actually headquartered outside of the U.S. So we could rattle off any number of companies from VW to Nestle to Siemens and go on down, but those are big exporters as well. And the reason that they're coming to the U.S. are, again, some things we sometimes take for granted but are hugely important, which are cheap energy costs. The fracking revolution over the last 10 years, even less really when it's really taken off, makes our energy much cheaper than a lot of places, much more reliable. We actually have a wider range of sources of energy. This is especially important in manufacturing, of course. Our actual people are hugely important. We have the best university system in the world, and people know that they're going to find talent here and they can come and hire fairly easily. We have rule of law. Again, we take it for granted, but go to a lot of markets around the world. It's hard to get contracts enforced. It's hard to protect your IP. We have all of that. And you could go on and on. We have a very strong banking system, thanks to Chase and PNC and many others, but we actually do. The strength of our capital markets, the ability for people to access the debt markets very quickly and very easily, these are all things we take for granted, but it makes so many other countries around the world envious. And as we travel, people always say, you know, you all beat yourselves up too much in the U.S. You talk about this isn't going well and that isn't going well. We can't invest enough in the United States, and you all right now are so well positioned, especially vis-a-vis Europe and some of the other emerging markets, which are really having some struggles. They still may be growing quickly in some instances, but there's a lot that they're finding challenging at the moment. So we always want to think about that as well, and this is one of the things that I applaud Columbus 2020 for, is thinking about both sides of that equation and not just segregating kind of the discussion into purely an exports discussion. A couple of other things I want to focus on are, let me see, the other thing I wanted to focus on to that point about exports is the reason we want to focus also on cities is the very thing that we're celebrating today, which is that pulling stakeholders together is much easier when you have a strong mayor, when you have a Columbus 2020, when you have corporate leadership that thinks this is important and comes together. You move out to the state or the national level, it becomes much harder. This is the spirit behind the District Export Council. It's the spirit behind what you all are doing. And it's local leaders, business leaders, and government leaders who have the credibility to pull things together and make these things really, really work. We also have found that there are often industry clusters in particular parts of the country, and if a metropolitan area can identify those areas where it's particularly strong, it can build on that more quickly and more effectively than we ever could at the federal level. So we're sometimes told at the federal level you can't pick which regions to focus on, you shouldn't dole out money according to kind of whoever comes in with the best state lobbyists. And we say it's absolutely right. When cities and metropolitan areas get themselves together on their own, then there's all we can do is be supportive, which is perfect. So we have Roberta, we have our overseas team, we have others, but when it comes from the local community, it makes it much easier for us to grab a hold. And this is what's really been impressive about Columbus 2020 and these early efforts through Chase, through Brookings back east, through Kenny, through the mayor. You all have been able to pull enough people together here that we're really seeing movement, and we really applaud everything that you all have been able to do. The final thing I want to say is a little bit about trade agreements, because one of the other things that we've been pushing is making more markets more easily accessible, reducing tariffs in those markets, trying to harmonize standards for when you sell into those markets, a whole slew of other things, which are the basic blocking and tackling elements of what the federal government can do to encourage exports or to increase exports. And within that, one of the things that I would note is that we have an initiative right now called Look South, which is just trying to emphasize to people that there are a lot of opportunities right here in this hemisphere. People talk a lot about various markets around the world, but we actually have free trade agreements with 11 countries in this hemisphere. So in many ways, you don't have to go far, and we want people to remember that. Two quick statistics I would give you. One is that very few U.S. companies export at all, about 3% depending how you define it. That's very low, especially if you looked at European countries or other parts of the world where they export, high 20s, 30s, 40% of companies even will export. So ours is very low. Interestingly, 60% of U.S. companies only export to one market of those who actually are exporting, and they tend to be Canada and Mexico. So the point that we always make is if you're doing one, why not go to 2, 3, 4, and 5? And that's really the way to spur growth. So that's a little bit also of the spirit of Look South. A lot of U.S. companies, especially manufacturing, maybe exporting into Mexico, we're encouraging them to move to Colombia, Brazil, Peru, a lot of the others that we have strong trading relationships with. More broadly, I would say a couple of things. One, there's been a lot of press about the Trans-Pacific Partnership that we're working on, which is an 11-nation trade agreement. And then there's one coming called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP and TPP. We can argue about the various merits of how it's going and when it's all going to get completed and all the rest, but the point I would make is if those two get completed, a full 65% of global GDP will be in a trade system essentially that we're at the center of that will create a platform for much easier trading for U.S. companies and on our terms essentially. So if you think about it, one of the challenges people have as they do business around the world is a lack of uniformity on any number of rules, and sometimes those rules are not particularly fair. Where if we can bring 65% of global GDP into essentially a system where it's much more transparent, there are clearer enforcement mechanisms if something goes wrong, if tariffs are lower across industries and so on, that's a huge benefit to the U.S. So I just mentioned that to say that there are a number of pieces of this pillar, but that's a really important one. And at some point, we're hopefully going to have a vote on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that really would be transformative. But then the one with the Europeans is coming as well and is very important. Two other things I would just note quickly. One is that I mentioned the Look South initiative. Clearly, a lot of people are exporting to Asia, and there's huge growth there. And Asia, I always try to remind people that I work with is really, there's not one Asia. There are easily 4 different regions that you have to break up if you're really going to have some success there. You can't just think so monolithically. There's huge growth there. The place that people tend to overlook there's huge growth is sub-Saharan Africa. And we've launched something called the Doing Business in Africa initiative at the Commerce Department. And we'd like to point out that 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. And there is huge opportunity, obviously, in the natural resources field, but also in any number of other places. IBM has sent a very senior executive over there because they're seeing the business services opportunities increasing quite rapidly. GE has done so as well, not only for power turbines, but for any number of other things that they're doing. But the point is the real opportunities, and one of the things we try to point out to people are that you ought to think about those markets that you read about in the paper, but also look beyond it to some that you're not. And one of the areas that's had huge growth in Eastern Africa in particular is mobile telephony and mobile banking. And the mobile payment systems are extraordinary over there. I was talking to someone a little earlier at Fisher and was saying, if I could have been in telecom in East Africa 15 years ago, I wouldn't be here right now. I'd be on a beach somewhere. So we have been trying to encourage people also to really think about some of the opportunities there, and Roberta and others can help facilitate some of that if that's of interest to any of your companies. So I'm going to stop so we can have a more of a discussion with Kenny, but that's a little bit of an overview of some things that we've been thinking about. And as I said, we're very excited to be here. We're very excited to be partnered with Columbus 2020 and look forward to talking to you all in a little more detail as we go through some of these questions and to being here in Columbus. Putting this on, maybe I'll ask the first question, and then there are microphones here, and Julia, I think you were maybe going to facilitate some of that. But the first question I'll ask Kenny is why? So why have you all launched this effort? Why is it worth your while? Why is there such a reception, it seems, for some of the things you're doing? Let's start with that, and then I'll move to others.
So first I'll say thank you to a number of people in the room. Thank you to first and foremost, Chase, for their sponsorship of the Brookings program. That's part of the answer to the question, which is we would not have been in it but for Chase. Second of all, I don't think we would have been in it, in the program, but for Mayor Coleman's urging, not only as mayor of the city and somebody who sees this as a real strategic imperative for our region, but also a board member of Columbus 2020 and sees it as something very important for our region. Also want to thank the steering committee members that we have, some of the exporters that we have around the table, and we've been asking questions over the last 18 months about trying to get smarter about this issue. I'll go back to something that the mayor said, which is, we think more and more that our region has to be more and more global. And we not only think our community has to be more global, but we think that our companies have great opportunities around the world. And so if a core value of our strategy is to first and foremost help the companies that are already here operating in our soil, both service providers and manufacturing companies, then we want to try to help make those companies more profitable by accessing markets around the world. The second part of that is we view it now, we didn't initially realize this, but we really see this as an integral part of everything that we're doing. Attracting business, working with local companies. We even think that it should be part of working with our startups. So imagine a company starting at Tech Columbus today, whatever app they're developing or whatever technology they're coming up with, we'd just like the question asked, is the best market for them outside the borders of the United States? And how can we help them make that happen more quickly? So we really believe this is something that with intentional, purposeful effort, we can make enormous gains and reach our 10-year goals.
And how can the federal government help with that, facilitate with that? What can we do differently or better to boost all this?
Well, this is where this really important to me through this process is we started to work with Brookings, which is a think tank. And this was really kind of a unique program for them where we were thinking about stuff and they wanted to use us sort of as a guinea pig to say, how is this actually really playing out in communities? And what I've been really impressed with is what we've been working on with a number of communities around the country, by the way. There's 12 of us that are going through the export program. and sort of have plans done, and there's about 8 others around the country that are now in this middle of this process, is the Department of Commerce has taken what we're learning through our market assessments and the work we're doing on the ground, and it's in the president's budget, and it's reflected in things that are happening nationally. And I think I would just underscore that listening and reacting with real things and real dollars to back these programs and to help companies and to help our communities is something that I've been very impressed by, and something that I didn't expect going into the program.
That's useful. And that's useful to hear. One of the things that we think about all the time is that we have a limited shelf life, if you will. I'm a political appointee, and several years will be a new administration. And if we're not able to really put this into communities and help spur some activities in these 12 cities and 8 more, it doesn't live on. And obviously you don't refashion an economy or help companies to expand internationally in the course of just a couple of years. This takes much longer. And so we're thrilled that at least by helping to push it along a little bit here, it's institutionalizing some of the things that you're doing, hopefully, and that's wonderful to hear.
Absolutely.
I think so many people here have such a range of experiences and perspectives. I'd really like to open it up if others have questions. But Julia, what's the best way to do that?
Let me build on one thing that Matt said during his presentation is 60% of our companies are exporting to one country. And one of the things that we learned during this process was that when you start, there's an inflection point when you start to export to 5 or 6 countries where your level of innovation as a company skyrockets. And so this isn't just a profitability strategy for our companies and pushing them to new markets around the world. It's really an innovation strategy. Another thing that we certainly weren't thinking when we started to study this topic. If you have to adopt your service or adopt your product to how they do business in China or India or Venezuela, then perhaps you learn something from that innovation and how you change your service offering, and then you bring that back home to our shores, and it may ignite an entirely new product line or a new way to deliver your service that's more profitable. And so we see this not only as, again, a profitability strategy and an economic strategy, but an innovation strategy for our community and our region. And that's absolutely critical. And the numbers back that up in any number of ways.
I think that goes to the core issue of competitiveness, and really what it seems to me that you all are doing, which is especially important, is making this region more competitive on a global scale. And again, you start with a number of assets being in the U.S., having Ohio State here, any number of other things, but like any other asset, those wither over time if you're not actually playing into them and you're not developing them and building on them. And as I mentioned when I was speaking a few minutes ago, particular clusters are also ones that catapult forward when there's additional attention. Think about a place like Austin, Texas, which has built out an incredible tech community. But you could go on down the line. There are any number of other places that really have boosted their population, boosted their overall economic growth with some of the focus that you're talking about.
Maybe just a few more things to build on your presentation. So we came down to really 2 core goals when we boiled everything down in the plan that's in front of you. It's very appropriate to call it Columbus Global Connect, by the way, which is, we think connecting the dots is really critical, maybe the most instrumental part of this. But we wanted to do 2 things. We want to go from punching below our weight. We're the 32nd largest region in the country, metropolitan-wise, 15th largest city. But we're the 38th largest export market. And we want to go from, again, punching below our weight to being in the top 25. If we do that, we'll have billions and billions of dollars of more goods and services exported from our region. We'll spread Columbus around the world, if you will. And we'll create thousands of jobs in the process in our own soil. And so that's really the main goal. The second thing is, as you know from when we've talked before, we're metrics oriented. We believe in being very accountable and filling pipelines and getting a stream of people that are qualified into Roberta's hands or in the Development Services Agency's hands at the state of Ohio or in our local government's hands to help them and provide services is really critical. So we want to create a flow of companies that 41% of our companies that are currently exporting aren't using any services at all. And we want to use that as a way to accelerate exports here.
And that's one of the things we were talking about earlier this morning is, as I mentioned, the federal government has a number of resources that you all can use and turn to. We've got something called the International Buyers Program, which will bring buyers from other parts of the world to a trade show or to a specific event here so they can see your wares right here in the region. But beyond the federal government, there are a lot of others out there. There are private sector entities that can help, and often people just don't know. Clearly the state can be very helpful here. So just making people aware and bringing all this into one place often is catalytic in itself. The one statistic also that I think we should mention is that Kenny talked about increasing exports broadly and the impact it has on jobs. The point we usually use when we're looking at this is about $1 billion in exports tends to create about 6,000 jobs in a place. And so if you start to walk that out and think about the overall goals of what it means to get in the top 25 or to double exports, those are really concrete impacts on local jobs. And of course, all those local jobs then produce more jobs, as you all know, as people go out to restaurants and spend more money and so on and so forth. So it really comes back to that at the end of the day. It's not just about hitting numbers, it's about helping people to create jobs.
Last year we did $9.3 billion of exports from our region. And for context, Indianapolis did around $17 billion. So if we can get up to the level that Indianapolis is doing, now they have some high value exports with Eli Lilly and some people like that. But if we can get to that level, you know, that's quite a few jobs. So we're adding maybe 30,000 jobs in the process of getting even up to par with some of the other cities that are in our Midwest region. Mm-hmm. And so we, again, as the mayor said, this smells like an opportunity to us. I would ask maybe members of the audience to come to the mic and form their questions, and we'd love to take some questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for being here. I'll get it started. I'm Jane Scott. One of the things that we struggle with that we don't necessarily want to export is college graduates. We know that a lot of folks come here from all over the world, go to our universities, and then perhaps would like to stay but can't. What can the federal government be doing to help a region like us that's rich with colleges that wants to grow more of a global community to keep those students here? Kenny, thinking in mind that if we have people from all over the world, they would be great conduits for our local companies to make friends all over the world. But it seems like such a shame. We teach them, give them our college expertise, and then send them home.
If I can maybe start and then can you pick it up? A couple of things. One, I was just over at Fisher and I was talking to some people over there about the export internship program, which does just that. Well, I have two actually. One that brings people overseas here, and another one that sends their students overseas to give them more experience. And you're absolutely right. This is one of the core strengths of the United States, going back a couple hundred years now, is that people come here with all their ideas and their talents, go to the best universities in the world. And the statistic that I often point to that people don't always, I think, fully grasp is that a full 40% of the Fortune 500 were founded by immigrants or children of immigrants. 40%. Think about how many hundreds of thousands of jobs that is. Think about how much GDP that accounts for. It's really extraordinary. And these are the iconic names like Sara Lee and Kraft and Goldman Sachs and Estee Lauder, and we could go down the list. I mean, it's really been part and parcel of America's economic strength always. I say that to say that one of the ways we can address it, and one of the ways that the president's been trying to address it, is through immigration reform and through changing some of the rules, which essentially are saying, come on here, come educate your best and your brightest, and then we're going to, as quickly as we can, send them back home so you could create jobs in other countries around the world. I often joke that it's a little bit like the Red Sox training all the Yankees players and then sending them back to the Yankees and saying, have at it. It just doesn't make sense. And that's what we're doing, essentially. So while that is not the only way to fix the problem, we think we could take really big steps forward in reforming our immigration system if we can just get it to a floor vote. And I won't go into all sorts of details right now, but we just need to push that forward. And if we can get it to a floor vote, we think the Senate bill potentially could be reconciled in such a way we could actually get something passed. It just needs to happen.
I will say that it's certainly a topic around our steering committee table. Having talented people with global exposure, those from other countries working inside of our companies in the Columbus region is critically important. I'll point to a program actually that the state of Ohio has, and Ohio State is a big part of, which is the Ohio State or the Ohio Internship Program for exports. And we're placing talented students inside of companies that, quite frankly, don't have the time or the resources to think about how they're going to approach and enter markets around the world. One of the things we learned through our market assessment is, hey, we'd like to get to that and think about international markets, but we just don't have the resources or the time. We place an intern inside that company for 12 weeks, paid for by the state and by the university, and it's really partially by the company, but at really low cost. And the results of that are phenomenal. Like 40% of the students that actually start and do that internship end up working for the company long term. There's been millions and millions of dollars of contracts signed because those students are actually inside those companies, and they're more than interns. They're literally, in some cases, just leading the international strategy for that company. And so what an impactful program. When we were in Washington talking about this program, UCLA was at the table with our partners from Los Angeles, and UCLA practically dove across the table to talk to Ohio State and to Wes from the state of Ohio about how we were doing this program, because it was something that they actually had not figured out how to do as well as we're doing. I would say about that kind of program, though, that we need to scale it. We have hundreds of small and medium-sized enterprises without all of the international expertise and the law firms inside, their corporate counsel inside, that really just need resources with that global exposure. And scaling that kind of program and having hundreds of students around our state doing that is a big deal. So stay tuned. You're going to hear more about us advocating for that.
Hi, Patrick Tarian, Columbus Council on World Affairs. Special thanks to the CMC for including us as a promotional partner for today's important program. You started talking about education, because as I think about profits, I think about people and the talent pipeline. Can you go even earlier in the education system, maybe the K-12 system, and tell us what, either one of you, do you think we're educating our children to be globally successful? And how well, and what are we doing well and maybe not so well? Thank you.
So part of our strategy is just to reach out to companies and have the conversation about what they need, and to really listen for not only where they're doing business around the world, but what's going to make them successful. Talent and our workforce is really topic number one across our region, and I would argue that it is topic number one if we were in Nashville or Birmingham or Salt Lake City. It's we need talented people, and we need fuel for our growth, and that comes through people. What we hear a lot, I would boil down into this statement. Our employers are saying we want people with core skills. They know how to work. They have soft skills. They know how to come to work and participate in teams. We want them to have global skills. And they need to have, even if they don't have a lot of international exposure, they need to have global awareness about the part that they're working on in a manufacturing plant probably was touched by people in 2 or 3 countries by the time they touch it, or the service that they're providing at OCLC or Chemical Abstracts is going to be software that's going to be used somewhere in another part of the globe. And the last thing is they need skills. So core global skills. And if we can equip our students and our young people with those 3 things, we're going to have an enormous advantage as a global center for business. And we'll have companies coming to us wanting to do more business here. Everybody is trying to crack this code. I think a lot of good work is being done, but we have a long, hard slog ahead of us to tackle that issue.
The only thing I would add is we certainly could be doing a better job across the board. The one thing I would add is that an awful lot of global fluency comes down to just linguistic aptitude. And to the extent that we're teaching foreign languages at earlier ages, the better. Even if it's only one other language someone speaks, that's a huge advantage. And having traveled around the world, that in so many other places people speak 2 and 3. So if there's one thing we could push, maybe that's really concrete, it might be doing more there.
Thank you, Todd Tooney with CMC. I first want to commend you, Kenny McDonald, for all the work that you've been doing in this effort, and for the mayor for just championing this and leading us through it. I'll tell you that, you know, what I'm hearing for the most part is it's a different mindset that you're asking our community to embrace, to think more globally. And listening to the fact that Chase, I know, has a global perspective, and there are many other companies here that have that. How do we, and what does it look like? How do we have Chase help us think about how we're communicating that global mindset, and also how are we taking smaller companies and having them kind of make that shift to be thinking more globally? Like, how does that happen, and how has it happened in other regions that we are competing with or comparing ourselves to?
Well, strategy number one for us is to, if you will, execute, and to take this subject, not only the subject of being global in every way that we possibly can, but also the subject of how to enter international markets and export, and make it part of the conversation. You know, every year our business retention and expansion team and our local partners across these 11 counties go out and they talk to about 500 or 600 companies that are operating in our soil. And we were having a conversation about what it's like to do business here. We were having the conversation about their workforce, perhaps about taxes. We weren't asking just one or two more questions, which was, where are you doing business? I relayed a story earlier today where we'll ask a company, are you exporting? Are you an exporter? And they'll say no. And we'll ask a company, are you doing business globally? Are you entered in international markets? Absolutely. Even the term exports is kind of it has some connotations to it. I think people think commodities. They maybe think agricultural products or something, which are some of our best exports as a state. But they're not thinking about the boardroom, and they're not thinking about strategy, and they're not thinking about how they maybe are selling software or their IP around the world. And so we think by having those backroom conversations inside the facilities with the people that are running the companies is a big deal. We also think having community conversations on a very consistent basis and just repeating this subject over and over again is going to create dialogue and opportunity for us as well, which is just raise the level of awareness of what this could mean to our economy, to our local companies, and quite frankly, to us. I'll just make one final point, which I made last week. Chase was through their foundation and their Skills Up program, made a very generous donation to our community last week of $2.5 million to work on the skills initiative. I would point to their investment in this as in the same way. Well, they're great community partners. They're also very good bankers. And their clients, if they're going to unhinge growth, they need people with skills fueling them, and they need these companies, particularly the small and medium-sized ones, doing business around the world. And so it is a smart philanthropic investment by Chase that is created the entire program that we've went through and has created this conversation today.
The other thing I might say is part of it, I think, is people just having fuller understanding of exactly what some of the opportunities are. So I'll just pick one area where literally there are hundreds of billions of dollars out there right now that kind of people could go win, and that's in infrastructure. And pick a part of the world that's growing rapidly, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's South Asia, you can just pick any region. We just got back from a trip to 3 countries in the Middle East where literally there are about $900 billion worth of projects coming, and they have the money to pay for it. Now, a lot of companies would say, okay, but I'm not a big construction engineering firm and we don't pave roads. How are we going to do anything there? Well, a lot of that work actually is on the energy side for things like smart grid companies and some small companies that have great technology for helping to optimize utility grids and that sort of thing. A lot of that is architects. There are architects all over the place who are going and doing an awful lot there. There's a great company in Chicago that went with us that does wastewater treatment facilities. Again, very standard stuff that most municipalities in the U.S. are already doing, but it's a mature market here. Whereas you can go other places and walk right in with open arms. You think about a place like Qatar, they're getting ready for the World Cup in 10 years. They can't build enough. I mean, these are literally cities that are coming up out of nowhere. So I think part of it, that's just one small example, but we were joking earlier about China. I was talking to someone about Wuhan, which is a city of 10 million people. Who's ever heard of Wuhan? They have like 30 cities with over 10 million people there. Well, just think about all the opportunities there just on housing, for example, or go down the scale as people get wealthier and as they move into the cities. Think about the basic health care. You might be a medical device maker. And you haven't thought about that, but that's a rapidly aging population. You can go on, but the point is I think once people start to see some of the actual opportunities and really see the numbers behind it, then hopefully it shifts the conversation to, wow, that sounds like a great opportunity and maybe I should take a few more steps towards it.
I'll add, so we've also learned a lot about the companies we have in our region through this process. So we have companies to those examples, River Consulting, which is a great engineering consulting firm here that we have in the region. They're doing business all over the world in the energy field, providing engineering services in the Middle East and all over South America. And they're right here, they're headquartered right here. Rolls-Royce, which is up in Mount Vernon, all of their product, 100% of their product that they make in Mount Vernon, major, huge gas turbines, is being, 100% of it is being sent outside the U.S. And we didn't know that before we started to ask some of these questions. Then the final thing is, I'll just point to the recent crisis that we're having in Russia. Something that came to our mind that would not have come to our mind a year and a half ago is how many of our companies are at risk of losing contracts because of the sanctions that we're imposing on Russia? And what risk does that pose to our regional economy? So 4 or 5 companies that we know through our process have major contracts, maybe major pieces of their revenue stream dedicated to doing business in Russia in the energy markets and things like that. Knowing that risk as a community is a critical factor for this program as well.
Hello, thank you for today. Thank you for being here. I'm Michelle Mills, Columbus City Council. I have a question and also a comment. In developing globally competent youth, we have to begin that work immediately. It's a sense of urgency. I was talking to an executive of Johnson & Johnson. Her role is to ensure internship opportunities for Johnson & Johnson. And 2 years in a row, she's had empty internship slots because of students not comfortable in going to other countries and exposure and all of those challenges that she's had in trying to have good representation and exposure for internship opportunities. So that is a sense of urgency when it comes to developing globally competent youth. My question of the day is that, Mr. McGuire, you talked about leveraging from an industry cluster mindset in terms of engaging in a global market. My question is, in the job growth side of that, is it the bounce back in those same industries if you're leveraging from a cluster mindset that the return of jobs are just in that cluster, or is there a ripple effect, and what other industries benefit when we as a city leverage from a industry cluster type of leveraging? Is it just going to just bounce back for the jobs in that particular industry, or is there a ripple effect that happens in other industries as a result of that?
There should certainly be a ripple effect in the sense that, especially when those clusters are innovative ones. So for example, you all have significant auto industry companies here, both suppliers and companies like Honda. And so if you think about some of the technology that comes out of the auto industry right now, it's highly, highly advanced electronics, which is applicable to other places. Some people have said recently cars are becoming rolling smartphones because of so much technology in the electronic side. Or think about some of the emissions technology that's coming forward as emission standards are increasing and the applicability that has for other parts of the environmental technology industry. So those would just be 2 examples that I would think of offhand. But certainly there's other effect. The other one would be, so let's say retail here, which needs a lot of logistics. Well, logistics starts to obviously grow and get stronger. You become even greater. Columbus is already a great intermodal hub, but becomes even stronger. Well, other people are starting to use that industry as well outside of retail and so on and so forth. I mean, you could go down a lot of examples, but it's really starting from those strengths and then building on them really does have a catapulting effect.
I'm Dave Pritchard, a retired civil engineer, and I certainly appreciate your comments on the opportunities for engineering in developing countries. I think that's where the work is. Also involved with Engineers Without Borders and with the Council on World Affairs. I guess one question, my limited involvement in work outside the U.S., outside of Western Europe, your problems you mentioned with legal structures, and in particular, you're usually trying to develop some involvement with local resources, people to work for you on the project, contribute to it, and there are problems with performance and problems with contractual relations that are undefined and difficult to enforce. So any advice or comments you have on that, how to handle that, I'd appreciate. Thanks.
Sure. Well, I think this part of this is one of the things that we often say to companies when they're starting to look at a market is it's better to get to know some of your U.S. government resources in country before the problems start. So that even if it's just touching base with the embassy and our commercial service team that's there, just so you have a point of contact and you know somebody, as things arise, it's much quicker to try and get them resolved. There are certainly, one of the things that we do in the countries where we operate around the world is provide legal services or point people towards various law firms and others who can act as on your behalf as you're going in. Clearly there are very nuanced issues around every single market and what one should and shouldn't do, and you don't want to learn that by trial and error. So what I would point to is, see what's out there, see what the opportunities are for people to help guide you as you enter that, so you can avoid a lot of the trouble, or knowing, for example, where the arbitration clause in contracts ought to be to ensure that you have arbitration in a venue that actually is more likely to be fair and impartial than it sometimes can be.
Roger Blackwell. Dr. McGuire, my question is for you. You've traveled all over the world, lived in London, just got back from the Middle East and so forth. So what is the reaction of people when you say you've been in Columbus, Ohio? What is, among business people all over the world, the image of Columbus, Ohio?
So, well, a couple ways to answer that. So I can't honestly say that I've had that conversation all that often in bringing up specific cities here. What I will say is that people are much more aware of what's going on here in this country than we often are of what's going on in other countries. I think when you talk about Columbus, and the way people respond is starting to nod heads when they start to understand all the companies that are based here, or start to understand the role that OSU has here. And generally what I would say is that in the conversations, and maybe it's not all over the world, but when Columbus comes up, people have a very positive reaction and know a couple of people who have been there, or know of the company, or say, oh, I didn't realize such and such was based there. This is a dynamic city, there's no question. It's one that's growing, that seems to be very positively thought of around the country, and certainly in Washington. But what I will do, I'm going to West Africa several weeks with the Secretary. I will ask that question and come back to you if I get any good responses. Sounds
Absolutely.
good. Sounds good.
Can I add one thing to that? As our team travels the globe, we have a team that Deb and Matt just got back from China from 10 days. We'll be in Japan in a few weeks. We'll be in Europe after that. And we're outside the U.S. 6 or 7 times a year. We cannot take for granted that we're in a competitive game. And I think part of getting our services and our companies do business around the world is also spreading our brands around the world. And that includes their attachment to the Columbus region and the city of Columbus. Making sure that those companies that are doing business all over the world make it a point to say, we're from Ohio, we're from Columbus, and I think that actually can accelerate and amplify any marketing effort we have locally. And we absolutely have to make that part of our strategy.
Great. Hope you enjoyed today's forum. We invite you to continue the conversation with coffee and cookies out in the lobby. Once more, thanks to our sponsors, J.P. Morgan Chase, the Columbus Regional Airport Authority, and our partners, the Columbus Council on World Affairs and the Greater Columbus Sister City International. Let's thank our speakers, Mayor Coleman, Matthew McGuire, Kenny McDonald. Thank you for being here. Enjoy your day.